Hi, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer, the president of Project Sentinel and the London Center for Policy Research, here today to continue our effort to provide the public real information relating to things they need to know about that, of course, the mainstream media does not care to cover. So today we're being joined by our distinguished fellow, Dr. Steve Hatfill. Steve is a virologist. He worked at Army AMRIDS. His background is notable, significant, and dare I say, factually focused on real issues. So, Steve, Dr. Hatfill, thank you for joining me today for Thought to Action.
It's quite a pleasure, Tony. Thank you.
So it's always great to have you join us, and I'm going to do my best to go through this because while I'm an academic. I pretend to be an academic on TV. I'm a spy, so we just try to figure these things out as we go. And this is an area of great complexity, but I do believe it's important that people understand what's going on. So suffice it to say that since the last time we spoke, you've done a great job of educating the public regarding helping inform people on what to do or not do regarding their children. You provided a great paper on the military, which right now, as we speak, they're trying to remove the vaccine requirement from for the military, which is something we've been on the forefront on for over a year. So again, that's your work, and I think people have recognized that your answer was the correct answer from day one. But now we're at a point where, Steve, it seems like the profit motive for big pharma continues to be the driving factor regarding what our U.S. government does regarding either informing or acting relating to the COVID vaccine, as well as the media, who seems to be, I just will say it, bought out by big pharma to basically not be willing to say and do things which are necessary for the public to understand. So I don't want to get you in trouble, but that's kind of the premise I'm going in with. Are you okay with that as a premise of how I'm laying this all out?
That's actually what the data shows.
Well, good. So that's going to, yeah. So I guess the first thing I was going to say is the vaccine is not a vaccine. It's actually gene therapy. Is that correct? Most of the vaccines that we're talking about here are gene therapy, not vaccines.
It's a biological product as defined by the FDA itself. It's not a vaccine.
Last time I checked, not a single one of these has been upgraded from experimental status. Is that accurate too?
Not in the United States.
So literally at this point, not a single one of these things that they're pushing to the public in the United States has been actually upgraded from an experimental vaccine or gene therapy. Is that a correct stipulation? I hate to sound like a lawyer, but I was trained to be one. So just saying.
It's correct. Absolutely.
Wow. So this is what I mean. It's like, how is it that we have a media that is not being honest with the American people about the fact they're being asked to retake sometimes 3, 4, 5 times an experimental vaccine, gene therapy, that actually the benefits of which have become insignificant. Recently, the Washington Post reported that more people are dying who are vaccinated than unvaccinated, which I think is a large fact that people, again, are ignoring for any number of reasons. So that's where I want to start, Steve, is since this is gene therapy, one of the notable side effects I've been reading about, and I'd like you to explain to our followers, is this idea that individuals who have taken this shot can potentially become incubators of new variants of COVID. Now, what that means basically is you get that shot, you get exposed to COVID. COVID can exist within that body and then mutate as the human being as the host. Is that an accurate representation of what potentially is happening from this gene therapy?
Yes, especially because we're talking about what's called an RNA virus.
Yeah, please explain this to our folks here.
There's DNA, which is genetic information that's encoded into these molecules.
Right.
And then there's RNA, which is a copy of the DNA. And this is what the body uses to put into the protein machinery to make a new protein. In this case, with the so-called vaccines, it's one of the proteins on the outer surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, right. COVID-19 virus. The problem is every time this virus replicates, it has to replicate its blueprints, and it makes tiny little errors in this process. So when you're looking even at a single individual, it's not identical copies of the virus in there. There's tiny little mistakes here and there in the daughter viruses that it's created. This is a survival advantage for the virus. So your immune system recognizes this protein, it makes an antibody response, makes a cell-mediated response, it gains control over it, but there's still these daughter viruses that are in there that may be slightly different that the immune system doesn't recognize.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what you're selecting for.
Wow.
You cannot vaccinate yourself out of this type of an RNA virus pandemic once it's started. Because the virus, by the time you've had the so-called vaccine and you've administered it, the virus has already moved on. It's not the same.
Right.
The virus that these so-called vaccines were made against were 3 years ago.
Yeah.
The virus is extinct. It's moved on into other forms, and these are the ones that escape the vaccination.
So to that point, Steve, would it be accurate for me to say that left to its own devices, COVID would replicate in kind of just an order of existence each time it replicates? You see the Omicron variant, all these variants. Eventually, left to its own devices, it's going to basically decrease in virility and just kind of fade away, become another flu. But if you allow it access to all of these inoculated people who have this RNA enhancer, this system in the body that actually is it does not go after the virus. It just stimulates your immune system. That stimulation, when combined with the variants caused by gene therapy, you're actually potentially creating new variants that would be harder to kill or more deadly against human beings if it's permitted to spread. Is that accurate, or am I being over the top here a little bit?
No, there's a natural selection process that's going on in response to the immune attack.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you have a virus that has enough mutations that the immune system no longer effectively recognizes it. Then that starts to become the dominant strain in the population. And if it's defeated your previous immunity, this is very easy to do. Usually, with time, a lot of mutations start to accumulate that are either not helpful, but they're not harmful. And it's excess baggage. And with time, most of these viruses pick up enough mutations that they lose their ability to cause severe disease. The Omicron strain is a lot less virulent than the previous strains. But it can back mutate just as well. You can't.
Well, that's what I'm kind of asking about regarding the fact if this gets into the human body. I hate to be bringing up popular literature, but the Omega Man, whole concept of something getting into the human genome and then mutating out. So my question, basically, again, not to be an alarmist, but are people who are now fully, 4, 5, 6 times vaccinated, boosted, they could potentially be the incubator for some backslide of the virus. It becomes more deadly again. Is that accurate? Is that possible within the current circumstance?
Well, there's so many mutations in this virus now. There's over 50. That is a lot of genetic baggage.
Right.
And what we're tending to do, I think, is actually all the vaccines have done is drug this whole process out over 3 years rather than it being over in a year.
Right.
We're starting to develop a broad herd immunity, but then we get another vaccine injection and the reprogramming of our immune system goes right back to square one against a virus that is no longer existing. So I
want to talk about that. Yeah, I want that to be our conclusion.
Onset of herd immunity here.
Right.
We're
Yeah. So I want that
reprogramming
to be kind of the prognosis.
each
Yeah.
time.
So,
Each vaccine you get, it takes us back to step one.
right.
And you lose that cross reactivity that you get with a natural infection.
So, Steve, my question becomes: you clearly are a doctor who took your oath of Hippocratic oath seriously. What's happened to the medical profession to see so many doctors not living up to the standard? And why isn't any of this actually the facts you just outlined? I believe our audience will find completely compelling and accurate. Why is it we can't get anybody in the medical community to come out and tell the truth, just like you just did about this issue?
The pressures that have been applied upon them have been from the so-called medical and scientific elite of our various medical associations, the AMA, the individual medical specialty associations. These people are retired in place. They don't keep up with the data, and they're influenced a great deal by the mass media and public perception of that.
Yeah.
And they haven't followed the data. They're completely unaware, and in fact, they get their updates from the mass media. Or I'll tell you what, the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine got pulled in, and he talked to the French 2 years ago. And he was complaining that the drug companies were forcing them to publish these very flawed papers on hydroxychloroquine and other aspects of the pandemic that should never have made it through peer review and should have never been published.
Mm-hmm.
The pharmaceutical companies have been trying to run this pandemic themselves and failing miserably. Well, not to generate profit.
They've generated great profit, but yes, I understand what you're saying, and I think that's, to me, that seems to be the primary driver here is the senior leadership at pharmaceutical companies.
We got doctors here before things settled down that you were prescribing hydroxychloroquine. Your family practice association state brought you in and threatened to revoke your license, and you had to undergo a psychiatric interview for prescribing hydroxychloroquine.
Wow.
Since Dr. Lapito has come in as the Surgeon General of Florida, all that nonsense has stopped, but
That's
not
good.
in all other states. And this is not how you run medicine. Doctors have had the freedom to prescribe medications as they deem fit to care for their patients from the beginning of medicine. And this has been taken away.
Right. Well, one of the things about that, I was in with a doctor recently who basically admitted that, I don't want to get into any details that would get him in trouble, because I think he was being honest, is that basically his job is to push drugs. He basically said, my job is to push drugs. And that was a bit scary, but I find probably pretty accurate based on what I'm seeing regarding this over-reliance on drugs rather than treatment. The two can be related, but I see there's a divergence between real treatment and drugs. Seems like drugs are always the treatment now instead of having other variants and options. Yeah. So speaking of treatment, Steve, my concern is this rampant myocarditis that seems to be plaguing the world related to those who have been inoculated. There's been a study in Germany. Pathologists in Germany have done a detailed study where they've done analysis of those who die within 28 days normally of being inoculated, or whatever the term is for being stuck with the gene therapy.
Right.
And they've concluded that lymphocyte aggregation, I hope I'm using it correctly, saying it correctly, is one of the primary causes. And basically, as I understand it, the lymphocyte aggregation has to do with your body's immune system reaction, basically T cells attacking something they consider a pathogen or something that's in the body. They attack it, they go around, and then next thing you know, they're clumping in the heart, creating blood clots, and people die from that. Is that an accurate kind of description of what is happening regarding the myocarditis, the reason you see the myocarditis showing up in people who are otherwise healthy?
It is. And it's real easy to understand.
Yeah, I'd like, please
Let's
explain.
talk about a bacterial infection and a disease
Sure.
called rheumatic fever. Everybody's heard of that.
Right.
What happens with a certain number of children or young teens is that they get a severe strep throat, group A staphylococcal strep throat, and streptococcal sore throat.
Right.
They make an immune response to it. It kills the bacteria, the tonsils settle down. And then about 2 weeks later, their heart valves start being attacked by the body's
Wow.
own immune system. The reason is that one of the proteins in the streptococcal bacteria is very similar to one of the proteins in your heart valves.
Wow.
And your immune system can't tell that, hey, this is me, don't attack me. And you get this avertant heart damage. This is what's going on here.
Wow.
One of the proteins in the heart muscle itself has some, we call it antigenic similarity to one of the proteins on the COVID-19 virus. So it wipes it out, but now your body is producing this spike protein constantly because you take a jab, that thing stays in your body, that messenger RNA stays in your body, forcing your cells to make this spike protein for months.
Wow.
And what you see,
so this to me is a pretty big issue that people should be told about in advance of taking any inoculation. Wouldn't you agree that this is a potential side effect that people should be told about?
Absolutely.
I don't think people are being told about this.
Oh, well, the medical associations know all about it. The professional medical associations, and they say nothing about it until it's now so obvious that they have to say something.
Wow.
Again,
going against the hypocritical.
This whole idea of informed consent, it's just been a travesty of medicine, what's been going on.
So
Regulated by our medical and scientific elites in this country.
Wow. So the only people I've seen this from so far is this German study, which has been very much, I guess, peer reviewed. It is considered now scientifically valid, which is great. But again, it's only in Germany who've done this detailed using all these pathologists in Germany. And Steve, I guess my question to you is, and I've seen you and there's a handful of other doctors who are doing the right thing. And as so often, you guys are the minority and don't have a great voice. But is there anything that can be done to try to influence some of these larger medical associations to say, it's just what you said, it's like people are being introduced and encouraged and sometimes directed to take an experimental treatment, which has potentially life-ending side effects. Why?
Well, here's what's happened, both with early outpatient drug treatment, which was the pandemic plan to start with, all the way to now. The scientific elites in this country decided to make the decision, we're going to block early outpatient treatment. We're going to negate it in the favor of a mass vaccination strategy.
Wow.
Which would never work, which was never going to work. They're not going to go back on it now. There's been 355 studies involving roughly almost 500,000 patients with about 5,000 scientists involved on the drug hydroxychloroquine, showing it doesn't cause cardiac effects. That's being caused by the virus itself. Right. If you give it very early, within the first 5 to 7 days of symptoms, you get sick, but mortality drops by anywhere from 60 to 80%.
Wow.
Most patients don't end up in hospital.
Yeah.
And you're left with a long-standing cross-reactive immunity that can see future new strains of the virus. It was the answer of what we did. The
Right.
AMA and other things got rid of this. Last
And
year,
so,
they tabled, doctors got together, delegates to the AMA, and they said, we want to go back and reintroduce our approval for hydroxychloroquine. They wouldn't even table for a vote on it, the
wow.
leadership of the AMA, because these guys don't want to go back and admit that they're partially responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of Americans.
Well, no doubt. And that's my next question. There's been a refusal, if you will, for most Americans to take a second or third booster, which, God bless them, I think some are waking up.
Yeah.
Is there a potential for the that I'm going to be careful because I don't want to get us demonetized or in trouble. Is there a potential that any damage caused by the initial inoculation or shot, will those potential damages fade away if you refuse to take additional booster shots? Will the body essentially self-cleanse and heal without additional boosters if you leave it to the body to do?
Well, the fact is, we don't know the long-term effects of any of these.
Gotcha.
And our surveillance systems aren't that accurate
Yeah.
to detect this. I will add one thing. This high incidence of this myocarditis, of heart inflammation, essentially, that we're seeing, is in our younger aged population groups, 40 and below.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you're giving this stuff to children.
Right.
And many are developing myocarditis. There is no such thing as a mild myocarditis.
Thank you for saying that. I wish people would
leaves
understand that.
Scarring. And it can interrupt the nerve transmission through the heart that makes it beat regular fashion.
Yeah.
We don't know what this is going to do when these children become adults. Or are they going to end up on pacemakers? Are they going to have other long-term effects, sudden death? We're seeing a rash, an epidemic of young athlete deaths. We wrote a paper on this last year where there were two little boys. They got vaccinated and they were both dead in a couple of days. They did an autopsy on them and they found this very peculiar pattern of heart damage. Are you aware of the broken heart syndrome?
I am not, Steve. Could you explain that real quick?
You have a elderly couple that are very much still in love after 50 years.
Oh, I just saw an article about this 102-year-old couple passing within.
And one dies and within hours.
Passed very quickly, yes.
There's a reason for this. When you have this type of stress, large amounts of adrenaline are released into the heart and the circulation, and this interferes with the blood supply of the heart. And this was the type of pattern of damage they were seeing in these two young boys post-vaccine. So part of the immune response is accompanied, in some cases, what we call these cytokine storms, is accompanied by elevated levels of norepinephrine, or adrenaline, if you will, that interferes with the normal blood supply to the heart. And you end up with dead muscle tissue. And I mean, that heals by scarring if you survive it.
No, my late stepdad died, and when they did the autopsy, he dropped over from a heart attack, and it turned out he'd had a previous heart attack, and there was scarring to prove it. So, what we could see here, Steve, is something like that, where people are unknowingly damaged, and then when you add additional stress to the body, they could drop over just from the permanent damage created by these conditions by the vaccine. Is that an accurate stipulation?
Yes. Look at all these sports people that are collapsing on the sports field. I mean, we're in the thousands of cases now. It's not just isolated things. This is happening with a regular frequency.
So I have two last questions for you. One is going to be the prognosis, what to expect, and I'll hold that to the last. But one other thing that I'd like to touch base on is this issue regarding the add-on to the actual virus. I know we could do a whole show on the origins of COVID, but Steve, you and your other doctors and associates have looked at this. You had mentioned that there's an add-on, a super antigen. Is that what it was?
Yeah.
That apparently is a biological warfare indicator that basically indicates to you that not only was this man-made, COVID, that it was also done in such a way to actually incorporate and include what many have identified as biological weapon grade modifications. Could you explain that to us a little bit? Because I think people need to understand what was found on the actual virus.
Yeah, we'll make it real simple.
Sure.
In the spike protein, which is the genetic instructions to make that, is what is in the mRNA vaccines. In the spike protein, there's a segment in what's called the S1 subunit of the spike protein that is very similar in its makeup, its sequence of amino acids, to a protein called staphylococcal enterotoxin B, or SEB. SEB was a biological warfare agent back in the 60s. When the U.S. had an offensive program, we made tons of it. What it does, it's a super antigen. It was never picked up on the blast searches, the sequence searches that are done, because the amino acids have been changed around. But if you do three-dimensional modeling of it, of SEB protein here, and this super antigen-like sequence in the spike protein, the conformation and twisting of both molecules, which is what gives them their function, are virtually identical. So we call it an SEB super antigen-like motif. What it does when the spike protein is created from the messenger RNA vaccine, spike protein appears on the cell surface, your immune system sees it, and instead of selective activation of these lymphocytes in your immune system, it turns on about 30-40% of your lymphocytes all at once. There's this massive outflow of what we call cytokines, which are inflammatory molecules. And in the most severe things, it leads to what we call a cytokine storm.
Which people have been concerned about, absolutely.
Well, we don't know how would this sequence from a bacteria end up in a virus in just the right place. So when the spike protein comes up and it's cleaved, this sequence flips out so it's available to lymphocytes.
Wow.
But we don't know where it came from. It's not in any other. We have thousands of coronaviruses cataloged. The computers can't find anything else like this.
Wow.
Where did this come from?
So this is, again, something else that people should be talking about in great detail, enthusiastically trying to seek answers. But again, Steve, it seems especially people like Dr. Fauci, who actually admitted in a deposition to that he basically suppressed the idea of a lab leak to help placate China. So it's clear that we have no officials who are interested in dealing with or asking hard questions about why this version of COVID has this super antigen on it and the others have never had it. So
it's even worse than that. Early on in the pandemic, the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, their leadership held a massive conference where the big tech, social media, major media, Reuters, major press, they all met and they formed this coalition for truth. And ostensibly it was to stop any misinformation about the virus. What it became is a censorship company that anything that didn't fit the narrative that they didn't like, or any doctors or individuals that were speaking out about things, were suppressed.
Wow.
And that's been in operation for 2.5 years now.
Well, we've seen that through Elon Musk's own exposure of Twitter and everything else going on. So I guess I shouldn't be surprised, but it's very clear that it's
It's functional and organized, Tony.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think
it's outrageous. It's outrageous.
To that point, I think I admire you for maintaining your oath, your Hippocratic oath, and I'm doing my best to maintain my oath of office relating to being a military officer. And I think a lot of us are trying our best to do that. So one last thing.
Yeah.
Prognosis. So it's a tough question. I'm not asking you to prognosticate. I'm not asking you to make a diagnosis. But what do you see happening now that today, I think we talked about some of the real realities, the factual realities we're facing regarding COVID and the vaccine and the mRNA and gene therapy. What do you see happening in going into 2023 based on what's going on right now regarding this issue?
It's very hard to predict with an RNA virus of this type that's rapidly mutating, but common sense would say that this thing already has so many mutations. Some of these in that SEB sequence, Omicron's usually a fairly mild infection. The people that are getting it and dying are usually the people that were going to die that year anyway. And this is in the multiple vaccinated. It's not in the unvaccinated. In fact, the multiple vaccinated are a threat to the unvaccinated.
I understand it.
So much genetic garbage that it's actually acting like a proper vaccine. Everyone's getting this thing, and they're building a cross-reactive immunity. So this is what we hoped would happen and what should have happened within a year if we hadn't have given these single protein, quote, vaccines.
Yeah.
We would have had cross-reactive herd immunity.
So I think, yeah, go ahead. Keep going.
I think this is going to turn into, just another thing that comes out, a quiet retreat into like an annual sort of wintertime flu, which 3 other coronaviruses do that already.
Right.
The problem is there's a lot of things out there that are getting ready to jump into man. We're seeing an average of 1 to 2 brand new viruses infecting humans that we've never seen before each year. Now, these aren't fully adapted to man. They cause quite a horrendous initial symptomatology and death, but they're poorly transmitted person to person. They still haven't quite learned how to adapt to man. These are out there, and they're appearing all the time. We've actually entered in the era of plagues. And deep in some jungle or forest somewhere, there's a pathogen that will emerge at some stage that will carry a mortality of 30 to 40%.
Wow.
We always assumed it would be one of the influenza viruses, but there's a lot of different types of viruses out there. We've been watching one called simian hemorrhagic fever, which until a year ago we thought was just confined to monkeys. It's got an almost 100% fatal rate in monkeys. Now we're seeing some human cases. It's made the jump.
One of the things I do always recommend people do, because of the point regarding other things out there being there that we don't fully understand, I encourage people to pick up your book, 3 Seconds Until Midnight, where you go through and provide a detailed explanation of what you just talked about things out there that we don't fully understand. And so if people really want to understand, people ought to pick this up. So,
Tony, there's a website where I put some of these papers, like DOD.
And we'll put it out as part of this, absolutely.
It's drstephenhatfill.com.
And you have some on the London Center website, and obviously we're going to ask you to be part of Project Sentinel, which is going to be focusing on these sorts of things as well. So
we've got a new one coming out, hopefully in December. I was at the White House for 2020. was the medical advisor to Peter Navarro.
Yeah, I'm glad you can talk about that now, because we couldn't talk about that for a while. So I'm glad we can.
But I watched
disclose
what
that.
happened. I had a front row seat, myself and my colleagues, and we watched this whole thing evolve with our mouths open. I mean, we could not believe. It's past stupidity. There was malice and intention involved here.
Well, that's what I'd like to. So as soon as you get the book done, Steve, obviously I'd like to have you do an outline of what the book is to promote it.
Sure.
And help the public understand what they're going to get, because you and I were talking a lot back then, and people understand we behind the scenes talk and we try to coordinate things to help benefit the public, as a think tank should do. Just saying, if you're going to be a think tank, you got to actually involve yourself in public good. But with that said, I think people do need to understand the chaos that was going on, that there were bad players. And I can't think of a worse player than Fauci. I mean, it seems to me he's enriched himself. Well, no, I guess we can talk about that when your book hits. That'll be great.
You can't just put out a book and here's what happens. There's things we can do to fix this so it never happens again. We can bring back the Office of Technology Assessment for the Congress. Outside independent.
I've said we need to do that. Absolutely.
There's things we can do to stop this so it never happens again. And we need to do it on a matter of urgency. So we can talk about that next time.
We will. So Dr. Steve Hatfill, thank you for being here today to help explain and provide a depth and understanding of these very complex issues. The one thing I always say, and I think you would agree, is that people should think for themselves. Any questions regarding treatment, especially an experimental, talk to your medical professional, talk to your family doctor. And I'm not always sure, what to expect, but that's the first place you need to go to talk to folks about what is best for your health. The government, just a little hint, the government doesn't have your best interest at heart. Just saying. I'm always skeptical of any three-letter agency telling
They're not
people
here to
what
help
to do.
you.
They're not there to help you. So again, thank you all for being here today to witness this. I'm Tony Shaffer, president of Project Sentinel and Center for Policy Research. We look forward to providing you more thought to actions in the future. Thank you very much.